This is another Read Me Something reward for Reich E. Spore's Patreon. We are reading from my Oz-based novel, Polychrome, Chapter 43. I stood at the forefront of the armies of Faerie and stared at our opposition. Less than a mile distant, thousands of forms, some mere dots as I would be at that range, others visible as twisted shapes that hinted at their immense size and power, others clearly engines of destruction, such as those of the gnomes in the Rainbow Kingdom, sat motionless, awaiting some signal to move forward. They sat directly in front of a narrow valley, the only pass through the low range of mountains that lay across our path. If we had to go around that, we'd add nearly 200 miles to our march and lose days of time, so getting through that pass was a major objective. My heart hammered fast, and my hands, when I reached back and grabbed my sword hilt for its faint reassurance, were clammy, slick with sweat. It was one thing to confront individual monsters, however terrifying. This was war, and before us were almost uncountable numbers of monsters, any of which were willing and perhaps able to kill me, or my allies. I glanced to Polychrome, something I was doing far too often to be safe. But she was beautiful, even more beautiful than I had remembered her, which seemed impossible. But in that silvery armor, sword at her side, she looked not just like the daughter of the rainbow, but more like a slender goddess of war, a Valkyrie whose courage was the equal of her beauty. I tore my gaze away and faced forward. What are we waiting for?
These things must be done properly, Nimbus responded. We have brought our armies to face one another. Now one or the other will send out messengers under truce. Most likely they will, as they hold this ground. And we shall formally introduce ourselves and present our demands, and they theirs. When we reject their terms, the battle will begin.
I shook my head. Where I come from, they'd have started the attack by now. Probably by a rearward assault, aerial bombardment, or simply having mined the area we're going to walk over.
Allow me to say I prefer this way. War is terrible enough without it being something without restraint or honor.
I wasn't going to argue with Nimbus. To be honest, I was of two minds on the matter. This was a prettier and more ceremonious way to wage war, perhaps, and seemed somehow more civilized, an echo of ancient traditions which probably had never really been adhered to in the real world, but in the end it was going to come down to the ugly, and the ceremony might simply be covering that up, allowing people to pretend the war was something more glorious and noble than it was. 5 figures were advancing across the waving grasses, carrying a white flag at the front. I glanced at the others. Polychrome nodded, and the 5 of us, Polychrome, myself, Nimbus, Ruggedo, and Zenga, moved forward to meet them. As they got closer, we could see that it was one humanoid figure, no, too short, a gnome almost certainly, with 4 others. One flowing, coiling torrent, a glowing-eyed Templar, dancing flame of inferno, and one of the green, black crackling tempests. Ruggedo was the first to speak.
Guff, my old friend, so we meet once more.
General Guff did a double-take as Ruggedo pulled back his hood.
Ruggedo, you cowardly old tyrant, you petulant little child, how do you come into this?
Only the narrowing of Ruggedo's eyes showed his annoyance at the insults.
Oh, here and there, old friend. I see you've found someone else to hold your leash while I've been gone.
Before Guff could do more than begin a snarling retort, rather, I thought, like the dog Ruggedo implied he was, Polychrome held up her hands. Enough! General Guff, you represent the armies of the usurpers? He looked proudly back at her.
I represent the armies of Ugu the Unbowed and Amanita Verdant, King and Queen of all Oz. They call upon you, who have intruded unwanted upon their domains, to surrender immediately or be destroyed. If you surrender, you shall be brought before them to experience their judgment and mercy." His smile did not engender confidence in the nature of that mercy. "I am Polychrome Glory, Princess of the Rainbow Kingdom," she responded, and the note I heard in her voice was that of steel being unsheathed. I felt a chill go down my spine. How can that make me find her even more gorgeous? I guess I like 'em badass as well as beautiful. That reminded me of Zenga in her triumph, and I looked at her on my other side. She had a smile like a tiger baring its teeth. Ah, yeah, that's definitely it. "I am Polychrome Glory," she continued, "and I lead the armies of Fairy, the Storm Legions, the Gnomes, and many others, and I say to you and your masters that it is you who must surrender or be destroyed." Guff began to laugh. "Silence!" The Gnome General's laughter cut off instantly, to his astonishment, and maybe, judging by the momentary blinking of her eyes, to Polychrome's as well. But she did not pause. "You laugh at your peril, Gnome, traitor to Fairy. Here assembled is a force never seen between the above and below, and though I be no warrior," the glittering of her armor making that seem an ironic and dangerous lie, "I have 75,000 at my command, and other powers besides. Consider well, General Guff, for this chance will not be given you again. Surrender, or if you will, stand aside and let us pass. Hinder us not, and you and your people will live past this day." Guff had recovered from the shock of her command, and was studying us with a military precision. He nodded, a tiny show of respect. "Your courteous offer is noted. But I and my associates," the four twisted elementals chuckled in tortured sounds, "feel you overstate your case and overestimate your powers. Perhaps, I say, you may gain victory over these forces, but many more await, and at the end you must face Amanita Verdant and Ugu the Unbowed, and none of you are their equal. So your offer, too, is rejected." "Then, General, the battle must begin. My pity to your forces." "Save that for your own."
Both groups withdrew speedily then, and I could feel tense sweat under my armor, cool though it usually kept me. And I am supposed to be one of their super weapons. Wonder how the regular warriors can stand it. "General," Polychrome said, still with the steel in her tone, "I give the command over to you. As you will, direct our forces, including myself." And then suddenly she turned to me, stepping away from Nimbus as he began signaling the troops. "Eric, I wish we were back in the Rainbow Kingdom studying," she said, in a voice that was shaky, low, unsure. At that moment I wanted nothing more than to reach out and take her in my arms, but even if she had allowed it, it would have been a terrible mistake. She might speak to me like this, but no one else could see she was any less than she had allowed herself to appear just a few moments ago. "So do I, Polly," I said, remembering the year I had spent with her. Now, I realized, the happiest year I had ever lived, though I had been driven by Nimbus to efforts I could never have imagined, though I hadn't ever had the courage, or more likely the stupidity, to speak to her about what I felt. "So do I. But this is the beginning of the end, one way or another. We'll finish this. And after—" She stopped suddenly. Could it be? I didn't dare think on that. "If there is an after for me," I reminded her, emphasizing what had obviously stopped her there. "If there is, well, we'll talk about that then." "Lord Eric, it begins," Regado said quietly. The usurper's army was on the move, a large contingent moving forward, a smaller group remaining concentrated before the pass through the mountains. At the same time, trumpets sounded, and now our army began to move, splitting into three sections, 25,000 to the left, 25,000 to the right, and the last 25,000 straight forward.
No subtlety of strategy this time, Nimbus said, as we marched forward slightly slower than the main body, letting them come between us and the initial forces of the enemy. I will keep my skills in reserve. The point of this battle, as we decided, is to hammer home to them our utter superiority. For that we use no special tactic save one, and that one after the first clash, when we have a chance to evaluate their forces.
Half a mile separated the forces, and suddenly, almost as though signaled by the same impulse, the great war machines on both sides cut loose. Red-blue bolts of lightning screamed out into the usurper's army from thunder of dawn and sunset, while black fireballs hurtled down upon our forces from a monstrous trebuchet seemed carven of dark bones. One globe of ebony was dropping towards us. I gathered myself, but Polychrome held up her hand and shouted something in which I heard the name of her father. Multicolored light caught the ball, crushed it into a shadow, into nothing. Other great weapons were firing, blasts of light and dark, cold and fire, stone missiles and concussions of air battering at each other. The two armies were moving now, charging, 150 yards apart, weapons cleared, spells being woven, shields of bright and dark materializing, gnomes in hard stone armor backing glittering crystal storm guards, while infernos and tempests bore down upon them. 100 yards, 50, 20. The clash of two armies was an echoing, shattering sound that shook the plains, thousands of throats shouting orders, screaming in rage or pain, swords meeting in bell-ringing opposition as spell rebounded from spell shield or tore through with terrible effect. Our fears were true. 1 to 1, our men and women were no match for most of the usurper's enchanted warriors, not even with the armor and arms of 2 fairy kingdoms to draw upon. Tempests swirled through the ranks, controlled in hungry tornadoes, while the Temblars bashed through their opposition like walking landslides. Infernos turned our soldiers to ash. Torrents battered shields and bodies aside like a remorseless flood. But there were far more of ours than theirs, and the monstrous creations of Ugu and Amanita had a fatal flaw. They were monsters, not very bright ones either, and were driven as much by hatred and a lust for destruction as they were by orders. Gnomes and storm legions reformed, organized, focused, and by blade and spear and spell began to methodically, mercilessly, and inexorably whittle away at the berserk elementals, withdrawing, striking, distracting, using the maddened hatred to blunt the charge, divert them to something just out of reach, and then strike from behind, causing the creatures to reverse, hitting them again. The human forces drafted from the 4 countries, Munchkin, Gillikin, Quadling, Winky, may have been enhanced, modified, or controlled, or merely intimidated into serving. But in no way could they match this trained and coordinated force, not even directed by a general such as Goof. I realized that even with the superior powers of the Dark Elementals, our army would triumph. But the goal here was not just triumph, but utter victory. Nimbus was watching, and I saw him straighten and gesture to us.
There, ahead of us. We need to break their hold on the pass. They have their most powerful forces there, he said. Princess, Lord Eric, Princess Zenga. Penitent, he continued. That is your goal. I want you to go and break them, cut through their forces from here to there as swiftly as you may, destroying what you can of their resources on the way, and then shatter their blockade. Lord Eric, you will lead the way, the others will follow and strike as they see best.
My mouth felt like sandpaper, and I almost couldn't speak. There's at least 4,000 or 5,000 warriors between here and there, and gods alone know what else, I thought, but I didn't say. Instead, I swallowed and pasted a smile on my face. No problem, I said. His smile showed he saw to my heart. He raised his hand, and the trumpeters blew a fanfare, one of those I realized they'd blown when I left the Rainbow Kingdom, and I glanced at Polychrome. She remembered, too, and for just an instant she grasped my hand, squeezed, and I squeezed back, and I had no doubts at all. See as your dreams. Be the hero, if only for a few days. I charged forward, and the 3 others followed, as the mass of the usurper's army loomed before us.